Hello and welcome to part 2. In this part, we're going to start to discuss the Titanomachy and the rise of the Olympians. But let's just talk a little bit about the Titans first. These Titans were the children of the primordial gods, and the primordial gods really in the version associated with Hesiod that you read really come from the void, chaos, the unordered universe. And there's going to be within that story the movement to cosmology, the ordered universe. And so we think of this time before the humans, as being, especially in the very beginning, as being chaotic. And with the birth of all of these cosmological and physical entities and powers and gods, we start to see the world for the Greeks that becomes the world for the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. So they're the children of the primordial gods, and they created stuff. So that's basically what they did, right? They created mountains, and they were the rivers, and the oceans primordial, but all of the things of the world, memory, the sunrise, the sunset, all of those things are born of that. Prophecy is even born during this time. And we see generations of prophecy that we'll get to with regards to the oracles, and before the oracles, gods that are associated with prophecy like Nyx. And so we'll talk about that, as well as Phoebe the moon. So the Titans seem more associated with disorder and closer to chaos. They may not be chaos in that they aren't chaos or the void themselves. They are the creation of that. It's tumultuous, mountains popping up, volcanoes exploding, that kind of stuff. Whereas the Olympians, in comparison, are divine. They created order. So the word cosmology comes about with the creation of the Olympians. They create cosmology. They create order from disorder. Even the way the older gods are dealt with, the way that they dealt with their children seemed more brutal. From the emasculation and the cutting of the genitals in the story of the primordials, to the Titanic Cronus eating and devouring his children. We get a different way of seeing them. We feel differently about them, the Titans. They're also very physical. When the primordials are also thought, I think of as this, their bodies become things. The blood drips from Ouranos and creates the Maenads. We get all of these kind of stories about that. The Titans become, in some of the stories, become the blood of them becomes the building blocks for the first humans. So they are very corporeal and very physical. They seem more brutal, though we get many stories of humans during the last age, and we haven't talked about them yet, but that show a Titan-esque way of being, and way of seeing the world. Some Greek thinkers drew direct connections between the Titans and humanity. I mean, the humanity of their day, the ancient Greeks. Olympiodorus, a Greek scholar, wrote that the humans grew from the ashes of the burning corpses of the Titans that were killed during the war. According to Plato, the human body is titanic in nature, but the soul is divine. all of these perspectives suggest that humanity contains some titanic element. And that element is in conflict with other elements within humans, within us. We are constantly in conflict between our titanic selves and our divine selves, Olympian selves. So it certainly leads us to understand that there was a capricious and uncertain relationship with the gods of their worlds for the ancient Greeks. They had an uneasy, uncertain, tenuous relationship with their gods. And this may be the reasoning behind why we might ask that. Why were the gods so like this? And part of it is that there is this gifting of different parts of them to the humans. And while maintaining a very distinct difference between the gods and the humans are definitely corporeal. They are bodies, flesh and blood, completely mortal. They die, right? And the gods do not. They are eternal, and but there are parts of them that are mirrored in humanity, and I think that that's an interesting idea. So it's interesting to me because, to me, it shows a little bit about how they saw themselves. The ancient Greeks saw themselves with respect to their divinities, and how different it is with the way that we see divinity working these days, sometimes. And most of all, we learn that even the mighty can fall. These are stories of generations. This is a story of the first generation, the primordials, losing out to the next generation, being imprisoned, taken down, moved, right, to a place of imprisonment by their children. And then the Olympians having to, because of that, having to again imprison the Titans. And it makes us think about this idea or concept of generations and how we view the generations. And maybe a little bit of light is shed on this idea of the fear of the new generation, right? And, I'm not gonna, or I guess I will, but make that jump or that leap to, the fear of, even now that we see the fear of generations losing out and changing into the new generation. It's something to think about with regards to that. And it shows us that even within this genealogy, that these incredibly great giant titans can be bested, right? They are bested a little bit through deception, right? Because of Rhea and Gaia and some of the others that move along with them. And we'll see with Prometheus as well, how deception and all of those things work with this. But to show that even this divinity, this great power source can be bested by the new gods. It's interesting. That takes us to the third generation of gods, which are the Olympians. And the Olympians, so basically the three sons of Cronus divided the universe into three kingdoms, and one for each to rule, right? And drew lots to determine who would rule each part. Zeus became the ruler of the heavens and the king of the gods because he usurped his father. Poseidon held dominion over the seas and waterways, and Hades ruled the underworld as king of the dead. Gaia became angry with the Olympians for their treatment of her children and the Titans, so she joined with Tartarus and bore Typhoon or Typhoeus, which is a monster that's described very differently by each author, though Hesiod describes him as having 100 dragon heads growing from his shoulders. And Typhus breathes fire from his dragon heads and causes the entire world to shake. And he wanted to take the power back away from Zeus. Some people say he's found at the bottom of Mount Etna and became a volcano. Zeus came down from Olympus to meet that monster head on and beat him down and hurled the thunderbolts that were given to him. And then there was just chaos again. The earth, the sea, and everything was engulfed in flames, and the entire world was just shaken. But Zeus finally defeated that monster and threw him into Tartarus, or possibly where he became the source of typhoon winds. But some authors do say that he was buried under Mount Etna in Sicily, where he became a volcano. Okay, so there's one rendition of the story, kind of retold through a few different lenses. And what kind of analysis do we get from this? So the story of Zeus, how Zeus came to rule over the gods and men, is obviously very violent, but it does have a few really important themes. One theme is the establishment of the rule of the Olympian gods. They sometimes symbolize justice, law, and order, especially a few of them. Definitely Zeus, definitely his daughter, Athena. They symbolize justice, law, and order over the Titans, who sometimes symbolize brute force. And Gaia, Uranus generation symbolize unbridled forces of nature. So we see from chaos to this unbridled forces to this brute force and just reaction to the later justice and law and thinking and all of those kinds of things kind of preemptively. This theme sometimes referred to as from chaos to cosmos, since cosmos means the ordered universe in Greek. Another more troubling theme, though, is the conflict between the generations as each father tries to suppress the rule of his sons. And we see that, and that's one of the big questions that I want to pose to you, is what does it say? We're going to get into a little bit more of the psychology and how we start to identify psychological ideas in early psychology, especially with Freud and Jung. We start to identify some of these things that are told in these really old and ancient stories because we have a hard time understanding why this was such a preoccupation with these specific ancient Greeks to tell these stories about this tenuous, violent, terrifying situation between father and son. And so I would pose that question to you. What do you get from it? What does it help you to understand? And especially in the readings, what can we come to in terms of analysis for this? So this week you're going to read from the pseudo Apollodorus, not to be confused with more famous 1st or 2nd century AD Greek Apollodorus. And you're going to read from this pseudo Apollodorus, although he is just named Apollodorus, in the library, which are excerpts from the early gods, the rise of Zeus and the Titanomachy. Within that, you're going to be reading about the beginnings of some of these gods. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that. In that Titanomachy and the discussion of the Olympians, he introduces the 12 Olympians, as well as Hades, which is also associated with being an Olympian. But there are different reasons why he's not always in the in the direct 12, and I'll talk about that later. So there's Zeus, there's Hera, there's Poseidon, there's Dionysus, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Athena, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Demeter, and then obviously Hades. These are the major gods. And by major, I mean, these are the ones that primarily more stories are written about. But as you can see, again, with the primordials being very small and simple, even though there are quite a few different primordial children, it gets more and more complex, and the genealogies become larger and larger and larger. So the primordials, then the Titans, a little bit larger, but still a simplified, a little bit more simple, easier to write down for sure. Then you get this proliferation of gods with the Olympian gods, demigods, naiads, all of these different beings that are partly divine or fully divine, and many stories about them. So it's not, I don't think, easy to say that there are just these 12 Olympians or 13 Olympians. But that it's important to recognize that the reason why we're talking about them is because there are more stories associated with those, and their relationships and interrelationships with each other. And then we are going to talk about, and most of the semester will be dealt with talking about the relationship between the humans and the Olympians, those especially that are the most written about, because we are trying to understand how ancient Greeks talked about and dealt with and thought about their divinity, their divine gods. So we're going to be reading a lot of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to end that part here, and I'm going to jump to the next part where I will be talking a little bit more specifically about the 3 major realms, and associated with the male gods. And we will get to the female gods later. And then we are also going to talk about how eventually how gender and sex even kind of starts to come into play with regards to this. So we are going to discuss all of those things, but I just wanted us to get started with the first 3 realms. And that's going to be obviously Zeus and his thunderbolts, Poseidon and his trident, and then Hades and his helmet, or his dogs. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next part. All right, I will talk to you later, and have a really great day. Bye-bye.